All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to class. This is LIT 302, Modern African Prose Fiction. My name is Dr. Ayo Item, and I'll be co-teaching the course with Dr. Micah Soko. The course outline has been given out, and each topic has been assigned to each lecturer. This morning, I'll be introducing the course, and I'll take the topic General Introduction, Social, Cultural, and Historical Background to Modern African Prose Fiction. Social, Cultural, and Historical Background to Modern African Prose Fiction. First of all, we have to take the key words that constitute the course apart and see what they mean, because I believe that that could also help when it comes to understanding what the course is all about. So, modern simply means that it is written. Modern African prose fiction. So modern means that it is written. It's contemporary literature, contemporary prose that exists in the written form, and that contrasted sharply with oral literature. So the mention of modern immediately signals that there is a kind of literature that is not written, which is oral. So modern gives the idea that it is written down. And then African signals the origin of that literature, or the subject of the literature, what the literature is all about. The literature is about Africa, written mostly by Africans. Of course, we should note that non-Africans can write African literature, as long as that literature is about Africa. The most important thing is that the literature should have African sensibilities. It should be about Africa and its culture and its people and its issues. Whether it is written by African writers or not. The most important thing is that it should be about Africa. Very important. Prose. We take prose fiction together because prose is written in paragraphs and chapters. It's a genre of literature written in paragraphs and chapters. But we normally divide prose into two broad types, which is fiction and non-fiction. So you now know that here we are dealing with fiction, African prose fiction. Fiction means that it is imagined. It is inspired by creativity and imagination. That the works interrogate possible occurrences in human society, not necessarily ones that actually happen. It's not like history. It's not like journalism or journalistic writing. It is based on imagination. It's inspired by imagination. Meaning that it documents possible human experiences in Africa that bear semblance with our lived realities, though not exactly what actually happened. We'll take note of that. So if it were non-fiction, then we would have been talking about memoir, biography, autobiography, and the others. But fiction, when we're talking about fiction, we are dealing with a short story, we're dealing with novels, and we're dealing with novellas. Prose fiction. Talk about prose fiction, we're dealing with short stories, we're dealing with novels, we're dealing with novellas, and of course novelettes. So I hope that really helps. So when we are talking about, we move now to the actual introduction. If everyone is enlightened on the key terms that make up the course. So when we talk about African prose fiction or modern African prose fiction, we have to consider its origins in two ways. We must consider the origin of modern African prose fiction in two ways. One way is the colonial encounter, and the other way is the oral tradition. These are the two ways that we can consider the origins of modern African prose fiction. And you will not do justice to the course if you don't take the two routes into consideration when examining the origins of African prose fiction. The colonial encounter and African oral tradition. Now, I will explain why that is so shortly. Contemporary criticism of modern African prose fiction tends to suggest that we are able to write and read, or read and write African prose fiction simply because we were colonized by the Europeans. Because when we were colonized by the Europeans, they brought the novel forms to Africa and taught our people how to write in European languages, say in the 18th and the 19th century. And that was how Africans started writing literary works, including modern, what we call modern African prose fiction. Then we also have scholars who believe that though the Europeans taught Africans how to write fiction, it does not mean that Africa did not have its literature. You need to follow the argument. According to them, Africans actually had their literature rooted in their oral tradition. Our storytelling tradition. Which embodies our culture as a people. The argument then is that when a writer started writing using the European language or the European languages, they did not write about Europe. They actually wrote about Africa and African experiences, using African raw materials in their arts. These materials are got from the African oral tradition. And that is how it is possible for us to claim that we had literature and we still have literature, in spite of the fact that we write the literature in European languages. Because when you pick up these novels, these short stories, novellas, and you start reading them, you see marks of African oral tradition in them, or African oral literature. And remember that what makes a literature of a people is the sensibility of the people expressed in that literature. And the sensibility here is found mostly in our culture, which our oral tradition embodies. And so in this text, you are likely to find our myths, our legends, our folk tales, our proverbs, our tongue twisters, our songs, our chants, our dance, and so on and so forth. So, how we authenticate African literature in modern times is that the substance of that literature, the sensibilities of that literature, are rooted in the African oral tradition, notwithstanding the fact that it is written in European languages. So how do we reconcile these two arguments? Because they are still contentious in the understanding of what our literature is all about today. And that is what we're going to do in this course, looking at the social, the cultural, and historical background to the modern African prose fiction. So this is a serious issue and you must follow the argument carefully. So it could be surprising to learn that there was a time in African critical thought when it was a seriously debatable issue as to whether there was a genre that could be termed modern African prose fiction. This was because Western critics found it difficult to concede the fact that Africa ever produced what could be termed an authentic African prose fiction. They believed that if African writers could write fiction, then it would be what they taught African writers to write. And so, this justified the European critics, we call them Eurocentric critics, claiming African works for themselves. They claimed that they were the ones who came to Africa, colonized us, and then educated us. They brought education to Africa, and through that education, they taught Africans how to write, how to read and write. And so when Africans started writing, they claimed whatever Africans wrote as their own. So the African prose fiction at some point was seen as an extension of the European novel. Whether it was Francophone, whether it was Anglophone, whether it was Lusophone prose fiction. So if it was Anglophone, the English will claim it. If it was Francophone, the French will claim it. If it was Lusophone, the Portuguese will claim it. Apart from the fact of claiming that they taught Africans how to write, they also claimed that since these works were written in European languages, the work should be called European literature. And that justifies why they called our literature an extension of European literature. Now, what I want you to note is that the language criterion in determining the authenticity of the modern African prose fiction is still a debatable issue today. And probably when it is your turn, you will also have your say on what the solution should be. So you see that the early African writers were educated in the colonial languages such as English, French, and Portuguese. In fact, they spoke and wrote these languages better than the indigenous languages, and it still happens till today. And so when they started writing, they didn't have any choice than to write in these languages. And for that, the European critical thinkers, the critics of European literature, felt that the language parameter should also be used to determine where African literature should belong. Meaning, if you write in English, then your literature belongs to English literature. And if you write in French, your literature should belong to French literature. And you write in Portuguese, then Portugal will claim your literature. So, once they claim this literature using that argument, they now decided that they should use European critical standards to criticize the literature. Once the Eurocentric critics claimed the literature for themselves based on the language criterion, they also decided that they should use European critical standards to criticize the work. Criticize the work means to say how good or how bad it is. And because they used European critical standards to judge our literature, many of our works fell short. Many of our works fell short. They mostly didn't see anything good with what our writers wrote. So mostly it was negative criticism. Because for the most part, they did not understand what we were writing. And we did not evolve our own critical methods. So the Europeans used their own critical methods to judge our works. And that's why most of our works fell short, according to them. They leveled many charges against our works, which when put together implies that these works were not up to par as far as they were concerned. But African writers were educated, and so they were not slaves at the level of the mind. They were not slaves at the level of the mind. They were truly educated. They were independent thinkers. And that's why they started fighting back to reclaim their literature. Well, I'm happy to announce that this war has been won. It was won a decade or two ago. And some of the soldiers are Chinua Achebe, Ayukwe Ama, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Abiola Irele, Chinwezu Eto'o. Those who fought and won this war for us include Chinua Achebe, Ayukwe Ama, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Abiola Irele, Chinwezu, and others. They wrote a series of papers and books to challenge Eurocentric views on African literature. They wrote a series of papers and books to challenge the Eurocentric views on African literature. So as we speak, you don't have to fight this war anymore. You are children of grace, coming into the study of African literature with little or no wars to fight. The heroes of the past have already done the job, and you guys are moving in time of peace, relative peace, of course. But of course, you have your role to play, which is to protect and ensure that we don't get back to a point when the Europeans will have their hands all over our literature. I hope we raise the right people to do the job, and not people who will sit back and watch as they take back our literature, God forbid. So at present, the African novel is the most dominant of all the genres of literature practiced in Africa. The African prose fiction has flourished. Now, it is a force to reckon with in the world of literature. And we have many of our writers out there who are making us proud on the world stage, including Chimamanda Adichie, Elana Bila, Sepi Ata, Wema Ban, Chigozie Bioma, Odua Akpabio. There are many of our writers who are doing well writing modern African prose fiction across the levels, whether it is the short story or the novella or the novel itself. So recent criticisms of the genre have revealed that the existence of the African prose fiction can be traced to the classical period, when most European literary works were said to have begun. That is, if you are following the written tradition. Okay? Remember, I told you from the beginning that we have two ways of determining the origin. Okay? If you are following the written tradition, where in scholarship we always trace development in fields to the classical period, then you have to do the same for the African prose fiction. For instance, just like the Malian Sandiata epic is generally cited to exemplify the enduring poetry tradition in Africa, just like the Malian Sandiata epic is generally cited to exemplify the enduring poetry tradition in Africa. The Golden Ass by Apuleius and Ethiopica by Heliodorus have been cited by Abiola Irele in Perspectives on the African Novel to indicate how the development of the African novel goes as far back as the classical times. So the modern African novel, as it is known today, came into being as a result of colonialism. This could be because the form of the novel, including its production and finishing, could be said to be a byproduct of the European Industrial Revolution during the 17th and the 18th centuries, which, among other things, brought about the invention of the printing machine, as well as the development of the art of writing and attainment of sophistication in communication using European languages like French, English, and Portuguese. So, what I'm trying to say is, what makes the novel distinctive, the modern African novel distinctive, is the application of technology to its production. And this technology came from the Industrial Revolution in the 17th and the 18th centuries, which coincides with the time that Africa was colonized by the Europeans. The Industrial Revolution was denoted by the use of machines to produce goods, including books, in large quantities. So, for me, if I can simplify it that way, the modern African novel is simply a transfer of knowledge or imagination and creativity from the oral mode to the written mode. And this is what the Europeans did. But the substance of that knowledge remained in the oral tradition of the people. And that is why we cannot allow the Europeans to claim our literature. Simply because you have transferred it from its oral mode to the written mode through the finished product called a book. And in a different language. As Achebe argues, writing in European languages was inevitable for most African writers, since these languages were imposed on them following colonial policies and ideologies. Colonialism did not come and ask you if you have a say in how you should be governed, in how you should be ruled, or in how things should happen in your society. They didn't ask for permission. They just say your language is trash, learn our own. Your culture is trash, learn our own culture. Your education is nothing, we will give you education. You don't have religion, we will give you religion, a better one. So colonialism was nothing other than an imposition of all aspects of European culture on the African person. They didn't ask for that permission, they didn't ask if they had a choice. And so that's why Achebe says that at the point of writing, he had to choose the language that is readily available to him, which is the English language, which was imposed on him. So writing in these languages was inevitable for the African writer educated in European school system, which resulted in the colonial interference in the African culture and societies. By that, it is meant that the disruptive effect of colonialism did not spare African writing. Colonialism affected all our aspects of life, including what we write and what we continue to write today. So, but we argue that African writing dates back to antiquity. against what the colonial masters want us to believe. That means we can debunk, going by what Abiola Irele is telling us here, we can debunk the claims that it was the Europeans who taught us writing, because going by the examples given in the Golden Hours and Ethiopica, African writing dates back to antiquity, classical times, because of course Africa is the cradle of human civilization. Civilization actually started in Africa. It was not the Europeans who civilized us. We were the ones who civilized the Europeans. They only cut the history halfway. They don't want to tell the complete history. And unfortunately, we believed what they told us. All right? It is now a well-known fact that most of the Greek philosophers that claim to know whatever they knew, including Aristotle, Plato, and the others, actually learned what they knew from African philosophers when they came to Egypt, at the time when Egyptians were actually black. Not the Egyptians that you see today. All right? Not the imported Egyptians. The real Egyptians were black. Okay? And Aristotle, Plato, and the others learned at the feet of black masters. The more civilized Spain and other parts of Europe. And so when they came back to destroy what we had here as civilization, they did it so as to claim that they destroy evidence that Africans civilized them. And that told twisted history to us, and we believe them. All right? The real people who civilized the world were black people. They were Africans. The Europeans didn't civilize anybody. All right? And that is the truth. So now we are grappling with the pieces of history left behind so that we can put together a narrative that reinstates our place in the world as the first set of people to exist as human. And we can do that also even with writing. It's important that we change our mentality and begin to believe the truth about ourselves so that we will not always look up to the white man as our savior. Okay? Because the white man is not the savior and will never be the savior. Because they are incapable of saving themselves to start with. So they cannot save us. Now, today, the irony of the African situation is that while most European countries and other superpowers survive all African resources, we still believe that they are rich and we are poor. Which is not true. It's just a system that they have put in place to make us poor while they look rich in our resources or with our resources. Okay, so but then let's stick to the writing aspect of it. Alan Ricard, in an article entitled African Writing, states that Africa is everywhere inscribed. This statement refers to the existence of some forms of writing in Africa before the advent of colonialism. Meaning that it is a lie for the Europeans to say that they were the ones who taught us writing. There was a writing system in place in Africa before the advent of colonialism. That's what Alan Ricard is trying to tell us. These writings were in the form of signs, pictures, and drawings. These writings were in the form of signs, S-I-G-N-S, pictures and drawings. They served communication purposes. For instance, in ancient Egypt, we had the hieroglyphic. We had the hieroglyphic forms of writing made up of signs and pictures. The Nsibidi scripts have also been documented as part of the forms of African writings that existed in pre-colonial Africa. The Nsibidi scripting was practiced by the Ibibio, the Efik, the Igbo, the Ejagam people of Nigeria in pre-colonial times. And even the colonial masters have acknowledged their existence and value by studying them and carting them away to their libraries in the West. But then they turned around to say that we do not have civilization. The sad thing is that we, the people who own the scripts, don't even know anything about it again today. But the Europeans have scholars who study them. We know English, and we're happy to know English, but we don't know Nsibidi scripts. The Nsibidi script was mostly, the reason it's not known, I think that was a mistake, was that it was mostly used for intelligence communication in pre-colonial society. You needed to have access in order to learn the language, because it was a language of intelligence. It was a language of war. It was a coded language only initiates knew how to use. For instance, you needed to be a member of the Ekpe society in order to learn Nsibidi. You need to be a member of the Ekpe society in order to learn Nsibidi. It was a language used to communicate security information that should not be open to everybody. It was a language of intelligence communication. That's why it is not well known. But the Europeans saw its value and they infiltrated the court, the Ekpe court, studied the language, documented, curated it, and took them to the libraries in the Western world. Because whenever anything has to do with knowledge, the Europeans must get it. We only are people that don't really care about knowledge. All we care about is how much money we can take from the treasury for our families and friends. Anything knowledge doesn't really concern us. So there's an argument as to whether these so-called illiterate writings should form part of the discourse in the historicization of literature or writing in Africa. Should these pre-colonial writings form part of the discourse in the historicization of literature and writing in Africa? To answer these questions, we have two schools of thought. We have to follow the argument. To answer these questions, we have two schools of thought. We have the inclusivist school, we have the exclusivist school. The inclusivist school of thought argues that these inscriptions should be considered part and parcel of African writing and should be studied as part of the development in African writing, so that the argument could be advanced that Africa would have developed a writing system, but not for the disruptive tendencies or effects of colonialism. The inclusivist school of thought argues that we should include these pre-colonial African writings and study them as part of the development of African writing, so that we can sustain the argument that if not for the disruptive effects of colonialism, we will have developed our own writing system, just like the Europeans. Because in some quarters, colonialism is seen, colonial Africa was seen as an arrested state. Then the exclusivist school of thought argues that since these illiterate writings did not metamorphose into effective means of civil communication, they should not be taken into consideration when discussing the development of writing in African literature. The exclusive school, or the exclusivist school, says we should exclude pre-colonial writings from the discussion of African literature and writing development, because they did not develop into full-fledged writing or sophisticated writing like the European writing system. Now, the reason they say so is to allow us to trace the development of African literature to oral tradition. The reason the exclusivist school of thought advances that argument is so that we can rely on oral tradition as a source of literature, a source of modern literature, where modern literature is written literature, as we said right from the beginning of the class. So when you exclude colonial writings from the discussion of the development of African literature, you then say that African literature began with oral tradition, began as oral tradition, just like any other literature in the world, including European ones. The argument is that no human society began with writing. No human society began with writing. All human societies started with orality. They started with the oral mode of communication. And that is the primacy of speech. Africans, first of all, had to speak before developing a writing system, just like the Europeans did with their literature. This is the part that many African critics told. The exclusivist school is the part that many African critics do, and that is how we fashion our literature and criticism. So the authenticity of the African prose fiction is rooted in the fact that it is written using the oral tradition of the people. This is because the oral tradition of a people forms the basic substance of their arts. It is the single most important raw material that determines the essence of an artwork. That is how you make your literature authentic. So when we pick up the modern African prose fiction written today, and we want to determine its African authenticity, we are actually looking for the marks of oral tradition in the literature. And when we find them, we can now claim and embrace them as our literature. We need to find our myths there, we need to find our legends there, we need to find our folk tales there, we need to find our proverbs there as the raw materials that make up that literature. We need to find our culture there. We need to find our sensibilities there. And one outstanding text in African literature, in African prose fiction that helps us exemplify this notion is Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. Because in Things Fall Apart, you find our myths, you find folk tales, you find our language, because the language is deployed in transliteration. We find our proverbs, we find the culture of the Igbo people there, and we could actually see that that is not an English novel, even though it is written in some form of English. That is an African novel. because of the oral tradition raw materials that we find in the work. That's how it is, and that's the argument. So no European will now come and tell you that because the novel is written in English, then it is not yours. So the language question is relevant, but it is not the criterion that should make someone claim another person's literature. The sensibility of the art object is more important in deciding where the art object belongs or originates from. The sensibilities of an art object are reflected in the cultural values of the people, all of which could be found in the people's oral literature. So when it comes to the issue of language, Achebe simply says that he has modified the English language to shoulder the cultural burden of his writing, so that when you read his English, it is no longer the English that came from England. That English has been nativized. That English has been indigenized. And sometimes when the European listens to our English, they don't understand a word from it. There's no longer their English. It is now Nigerian English. That's what Achebe says. And so if you have modified that language, you can also use it for your literature. Because the language, having existed here for many years, has taken its own tone, its own conviction, that's different from the one spoken in England. And so that way we can also claim the language. So a re-examination of the history of the African novel reveals that the early 20th century phenomenon which characterized the evolution of the novel was also prevalent in classical antiquity, when such novels as Ethiopica and the Golden Ass were written through the appropriation of a foreign language. A study of these classical novels indicates that though they are written in Greek and Latin respectively, they depict African sensibilities because the two novels are set in Africa and have African setting. So that is how we claim that literature is from a particular place. When it has the setting of the place, it talks about the people of the place, it doesn't matter the language that it is used to discuss those things. That's the argument. So what is modern African prose fiction? What is modern African prose fiction? We will define modern African prose fiction by defining it as the African novel. So the African novel has been defined as a fictional prose of considerable length, either written by an African or non-African, but which is about Africa and depicts the African sensibilities, with sensibility being the kind of feeling we have when we hear, see, or think about something. The African novel has been defined as a fictional prose of considerable length, either written by an African or non-African, but which is about Africa and depicts the African sensibilities, where African sensibilities refer to the kind of feeling we have when we hear, see, or think about something. It should be noted that an African critic by name C.A. Ibitoye, in a 1994 publication entitled Stages of Development of African Literature, states that a novel can have non-African authorship as long as it depicts African sensibilities or concerns, or it is about Africa. A further thought on the definition of African novel consists that it could be written in English and other languages other than African languages. A further thought on the definition of African novel consists that it could be written in English and other languages other than African languages. So you can write the African novel in English or in any of the African languages or any language that's not African language. One of the scholars who believe that the use of English does not in any way subtract from the authenticity of the African novel is Chinua Achebe. They believe that though you use English in writing your novel, although we use English in writing a novel, it does not stop the novel from being an authentic African novel. He made this statement in a 1975 essay. Achebe made this statement in a 1975 essay entitled Morning Yet on Creation Day. In this essay, Achebe explains why he resorts to English at the point of writing.